and to relate to programs that were in process too, like Model Cities program, job training programs, housing programs. And so I learned about the needs. The first 6 months, by the way, I was in San Jose, because I was trying to help organize the school of social work, and then I was at MACSA. But the first 6 months I spent going to every meeting there was that impacted or had something to do with the Chicano community. School board meetings, city council meetings, board of supervisors, water meetings, whatever. And I just went to listen. I listened a lot. And I listened to people, and I learned to pick out who were the talkers, who were the obvious leaders, but who were the informal leaders, which is what organizers have to know about. And what did they say to each other when they went off to these breaks and groups started forming? And so my training in understanding group dynamics came in handy. And the communications, understanding how people communicated, understanding what information people got, how it was used. And that was all valuable, because when I went back to teach it subsequently to the School of Social Work, but also I got to work with some of the Chicano groups that were part of Cesar Chavez's causa, like Chino Vasquez out in Gilroy. And I helped them get funding when I was at MACSA for developing greenhouse co-ops in there and in Morgan Hill. So what I'm saying is that I had to formulate relationships with key people in the barrio, in the school settings, in the corporate settings, and in the political settings, so that they learned to trust me, and I would learn how much to trust them. And that was a strength I brought from Phoenix, because I learned how to work with the power structure types there, as well with the kids in school, and the blacks and Chicano kids who were having conflicts, and the parents. So those were the experiences and skills I brought in. And I think they were recognized, especially by a guy like Jose Carrasco at the time, but also by a guy like the school superintendent, Chuck Knight, and also Bert Burns, who was the academic vice president, acting president. And I, because of my relationships, what I'm saying, I was able to share information and communicate to them where programs stood, what resources we needed, and why it was important for them to advocate in our behalf. And that's where also the women thing came in, because I learned, I could see where the women were getting into positions of power. And I says, I better learn how to relate to them, because we're going to need them down the line.
Tell me, give us some names of the women you're talking about.
I'm talking about, well, later on, Gail Fullerton became president of the university. And when I returned to, well, it was Armand that came to me after I'd been in MACSA almost 6 years, and said to me, Jose, he took me out for coffee or lunch, I forget what. He said, we have a position we need at the university that maybe you could look at. So the women I got to know were also women that had important positions at San Jose State, at San Jose Unified, with the city, and with the county. People like Janet Gray Hayes, the mayor of the city of San Jose subsequently. People like Gail Fullerton, who was the president of, became the president of San Jose State University. People like Sally Reed, who was the executive director of the Santa Clara County. And there were others that were department heads, that were deans of the university. And I made it my responsibility to inform them about how the programs that I was working with were developing, or that we needed resources, or that we needed their help in certain areas. So women became very important advocates for us. There were Sybil Ware, the name pops up. There were women I met. I've mentioned by name some of the women in key positions. But the other thing that there were women at mid-level management, shall we say, kind of positions as department heads or in charge of programs at the university. A lot of women. And so I learned to have a cup of coffee with them or visit them and explain what we were doing. I was always explaining to key people what we were trying to do with Chicano studies, school social work, the bilingual studio lab, and related programs and services at MACSA, United Way Types. So women became important to us. And some things I did that some of the Chicanos couldn't understand. Why are you wasting your time on that? Like one of the things that I had MACSA do is that I hired this lady, Mary Raw, to help establish a battered women's shelter in the North Peninsula, up here. What's MACSA doing up there? And I said, I have one of my staff people, Mary Raw, that's a woman, and she's working with other women that are key not only in San Jose or Santa Clara County, but in the Bay Area, to establish the first battered women's shelter. And most of those battered women that need shelter are gringas. And they've been battered by their husbands who happen to be key people in certain positions. And I want to find out from those women what's happened to them, who did what to them, because those are the cotton pickers that we don't want to call on to help us. Because if they're violent toward their own wives or others, women, we don't want that type. And so they said, oh, okay, well, it makes kind of sense. So it was key that we identify ways to penetrate the feminist movement at the time.
I was gonna,
Oh, Charlotte, what was that? I forget.
I was gonna ask you, so speaking about Latina women of that time, in the period you were in San Jose Unified, if you have names of Latinas who were leading in that time, the period that you went to MACSA, and they were leading at the time, and then I think the period of when you were back at San Jose State for a number of years. Just back, I'm asking you, so back at, when you first got here to San Jose State for 2 years, then went for 2 years to San Jose Unified, who were some of the Latina women that were involved at that time?
Well, P. Robinson comes to mind. Aurora Quevedo comes to mind. There were others. Judith Garza. Did I say Judith yet? But then there were others. She was. I'm blocking on some names, but there were people. I learned something very valuable about how to reach a corporate executive, for instance. The thing I learned, and Jose Carrasco said this to me, don't take up time of any important people because they don't have time to waste. They're the kind that want to zip, zip, zip. And so I took that piece of information and I said, well, then I need to relate to their secretaries. Because the secretary of a key corporate executive knows what the hell's going on. He knows what the boss needs, what he wants, whether it's a cup of coffee or the important phone call to the governor or whatever. So I learned early on to pay attention to secretaries, and I don't know that I can name any names, but I know that's how I related to the university president, to Janet Gray Hayes, who was the city mayor. I learned the names of, and some of them were Chicano women, and I cannot spit out their names now, but I know that I learned that if I went through them, and I'd say what I wanted, and if the boss can help me, let me know, let her know. So she could find out yes, no, or he'll meet you for coffee or lunch or whatever. So I learned how to use those key secretary type of people. And they were all women. So, of course, the fact that I was charming helped a little bit and whatever.
While you were at San Jose Unified.
But getting back to the women, I mean, Chicana women, Sophie Mendoza certainly was very key. B. Robinson, when I was in the middle of the Denny Trevino killing, and we were at Guadalupe Church dealing with a very serious issue, and I was up there and I had sat down and I was kind of burned out. I mean, I got burned out here and there, and I'm sure I was looking very tired. B. Robinson was sitting behind me, and she passed me a little piece of paper, and in the piece of paper it just said, you're so cute. So that kind of got me, stoked a little bit. But they were very sensitive. That's what I'm saying, the Chicano women particularly were very sensitive about the work I was doing, the support I needed, and communicating to me key information. And one thing I always taught my students is there are people with key information, important information, valuable information, that'll give it to you so long as you don't squeal on it. You don't blow the whistle on it. Protect your sources of information. And that's what I learned to do. And I made a couple of mistakes along the way, but Drina Collins, for instance, who worked for PG&E, I think, she was a key person really to the executive of PG&E. And later on, I got things out of him that it was because Drina kept me informed. I'd have lunch with her. She says, Jose, this is going on. So in effect, I had informants out there in key positions, key places, and Chicanos played a very key role in that. There were the same at the university level, but at San Jose Unified, we had very few Chicanos, but the ones that were there, I learned to relate to, like, the head of one of the programs. And I'm blocking on the name. But they learned to trust me is the point. And I learned to trust them. But the only way to develop trust is that if you it has to be a reciprocal dynamic. I learned that in that reciprocal dynamic, we have to learn how to communicate effectively and how to share critical information. And if you do that on a respect basis, trust basis, the relationship helps to build what we call a power base. And that's what I built. I had a very effective power base working for me. So did Jack Brito in his own way, so did Sophie Mendoza. And so did some other key Chicana people, Chicanos. I personally interviewed, for instance, Esther Medina to join our board of directors, to come and help us out she was working for OEO program there, I forget what it was called. But she became later the executive director. And here was a Chicana that didn't have any education, but that learned how to use resources. And so I said, we can use a person like that. Rosa Maria Hernandez, who was my secretary, she also became executive of MACSA for a while. There were others. So I learned that if I developed a relationship built on trust and respect, that I was doing something that Chicanos. So by having that respect and that trust from women and from men, both ways, I think that's what gave me any validity or sense of belonging in San Jose.
Going back to the period that you were at San Jose Unified, there were some other major things going on. Maybe you can tell me about how you were related to them. One was, there was a field act where a bunch of the old schools came down and a whole bunch of new ones went up. That was a big activity. Also, there was a desegregation lawsuit forming during that time. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, the Anti-Earthquake Safety Act, or whatever it was called, gave us an opportunity to test the school district on its seriousness about really developing a model school. So I was then chairman of MAGS, and Dr. Galarza already had his idea and concept of bilingual studio lab. So what some of us looked at a little bit was, can we take one of those downtown new schools that's in the Mexican American community mostly, and say, we, MAGS, in partnership with the School of Education and the School of Social Work, take over that school. And we decide what teachers go into that school that'll help us with not only bilingual, but the regular curricular studies that are part of any child's learning. And that was a heck of a powerful idea, because had we succeeded at that, it would have been a model for the district to do what we did there. And we said, we'll let the kids take tests, we'll let anybody come in and see what we're doing, but give us the chance. Well, they didn't. They, quite frankly, I think they were very insecure about it. Like, had we succeeded, then it would have really shown up a lot of things. But that was one thing that came out of the earthquake rebuilding program. The other was just simply, how do parents become involved and really assume ownership for a school, where they know that after school hours they can have meetings or their own classes, or a ver cómo pueden coser ropa, take care of some of the things with equipment they don't have at home. And so we wanted to make that a provision. We had all kinds of ideas about, it's an all communist thing that if you feed a guy, you can talk dialectic, but if you don't feed him, you just can't preach dialectic. So we weren't communists, but we had similar ideas about how do you relate to the community's needs, and who defines those needs. So it was a matter both of definition, of learning opportunities, and of caring for each other. Especially parents care for children. And our cultura plays a big role in that kind of thing. Because children are born, as Dr. Galarza said, nurtured by culture and safeguarded and raised in a safe environment and all that sort of thing. So we tried to take advantage of that earthquake program of new schools, but we struck out on that. And I think that even the education department, Lou, what was his name, was a dean. He was broad-minded enough to hire Dr. Galarza as a distinguished visiting scholar, but he was a little skeptical about us taking over a school, because we were saying to him, we of course want to meet with, we want to comply with credentialing kind of requirements, etc. But we wanted first choice on who gets hired and what programs are needed if there's an effective Anglo teacher that's really good and kids like a lot, that's someone we'd like to look at. Because we want the best teachers. We want, and if there are people that are really interested in being good teachers, we want to hire the best teachers to help train them. But then we want those best teachers to also know what we're about, so that they can incorporate into curricular kind of strategies how to incorporate our culture and our language. That scared the hell out of people. So, Atzlan and taking over Atzlan, sort of reactionary stuff. But we talked about those things and we tried it. But the best thing we could do was to take the bilingual studio lab to San Jose Unified School District. At the time, that's the best we could do.
Also, during the time you were at San Jose Unified, was the desegregation lawsuit that occurred at San Jose Unified, was that part of the time you were there?
It started, as much as I can recall, it started while I was there, and one of the moving forces for that lawsuit, quite frankly, was Jack Brito, because Jack had a good relationship with Steve Manley and Jim Ono and other people that were concerned about the educational needs of minority groups, but particularly Mexican-American children, Chicano kids. And so I think the planning for that lawsuit did come out of our presence there, knowing what was happening. And so that information, Jack was very good at this, that information was conveyed to people like Steve Manley and Jim Ono, and they decided that maybe the best thing to do was to hit the school district with a lawsuit. Slap them all over the place, because otherwise we were having trouble getting their attention. And in the meantime, then I left my position with the school district and went to MACSA. So we continued, and Jack in particular continued pushing for that. And he had me sign. It was him that influenced a lot of us. Strong-armed us, I should say, too. That was good to get things moving in terms of a lawsuit and in terms of desegregation and in terms of what resources or what resource can we mobilize that would get the not only the attention of the school district, but the other valuable lesson we learned about that was to get the public attention that could get publicity. So it was very important for us to look at, and we had discussions, and Jack pointed things out to us, but discussions on what happens if we try this, or what happens if we try that, or what is the end result that we expect, you know. And so it did start with discussions while I was there, but it continued with active discussions because Jack had been hired through Title I funds, I think, to help the parent organizing in the school district. And when I went to MACSA, became executive director, then I hired him as my associate director. And he continued to not only strategize, but to develop more specific plans in terms of what would a legal suit do for the children, for parents, and for to get the school district off of the dime, so to speak. And the lawsuit then got formulated, and those two lawyers, as I recall, were our resources to get it together. But what resulted from that is that the district had to, in fact, seriously look at how to go about desegregation of some of those schools, and how they had to use the buses mostly. But then also it led to hiring more Chicano teachers and minority teachers, how to do reporting, public reporting on the status of teaching curriculum and training of teachers that could relate to the needs of Mexican American children. So I think it had a good effect. It was kind of a slap in the face to wake up, you know, the school board and the school district and the administration to the fact that they were saying, oh, we're doing all we can. BS. They weren't doing all they could. That lawsuit was a wake-up call. That's what it was.